Welcome to this deep dive.
Okay.
And we're going to explore a really complex chapter of American history here.
Okay.
Um, the experiences of African American veterans returning home after World War I.
Right.
We're using a Wikipedia article as
Yeah.
our guide, and this one focuses specifically on the lynching of these veterans.
Oh,
So, our mission is to unravel not just the history, but also the deep seated prejudices these soldiers faced and, the struggle for equality that continued long after the war was over.
yeah. It's a story of contrasts, isn't it?
Yeah.
You have these soldiers fighting for democracy abroad while facing intense racism back home.
That's it, the double victory.
Yeah.
Many Black Americans saw World War I as a chance to prove their patriotism and secure equal rights.
Hmm.
They were fighting for their nation on the front lines and simultaneously battling for equality back in the U.S.
Exactly.
But did their service change anything? Did they come home to the respect and recognition they deserved?
Sadly, no. The reality they encountered was far from the equality they fought for. While many white veterans were hailed as heroes, black veterans returned to a society still deeply entrenched in racial prejudice.
It's almost unimaginable to risk your life for your country only to be denied basic dignity and respect upon your return.
And there's this chilling quote from Senator James K. Vardaman of Mississippi that truly captures the sentiment of the time. He feared black veterans returning with a heightened sense of entitlement to their rights.
Wow.
Think about that. A sitting senator expressing fear over black veterans, demanding the very rights they fought to defend.
That really underscores the deeply ingrained racism of the era.
Right,
Makes
yeah.
you wonder, did this fear contribute to the violence that erupted in the years following the war?
It's definitely a factor, and we can't ignore the context of the Great Migration during this period. World War I created labor shortages, prompting a massive movement of African Americans from the South to northern cities in search of jobs. And while this migration offered new opportunities, it also led to increased racial tensions and, sadly, violence.
So the influx of Black Americans into northern cities, even though it was driven by the needs of the war effort, actually increased segregation and conflict.
Sadly, yes. It created a powder keg of resentment and fear in some segments of society, ultimately setting the stage for what became known as the Red Summer of 1919.
Okay, this Red Summer, I've heard the term, but what exactly happened?
Essentially, it was a wave of horrific racial violence that swept across the U.S. And we're not talking about isolated incidents here. Over 36 cities and counties were engulfed in these race riots, and the death toll is staggering.
That many.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't just a Southern phenomenon then.
Not at all. The Red Summer showed that racial tensions and violence were a nationwide problem. Take the Elaine Massacre in Arkansas, for example. Estimates suggest that anywhere from 100 to 240 black people were killed. And then you have major cities like Chicago and Washington, D.C., both ravaged by race riots with significant death tolls and widespread property damage. The scale of the violence was absolutely horrific.
It sounds like the country was on the brink of implosion. Did these riots directly target returning Black veterans?
While many victims were simply black residents caught in the crossfire, veterans were specifically targeted in many cases. In fact, the Wikipedia article we're using lists numerous examples of black veterans who were lynched in the aftermath of the war.
Lynchings.
Mm.
What were the supposed justifications for these horrific acts?
You'd be surprised, or maybe not, at how flimsy the accusations often were. Some are accused of crimes with little or no evidence, while others were targeted for the most trivial of reasons.
So give me an example. What kind of trivial reasons led to a man being lynched?
Take the case of Private Charles Lewis, lynched in Kentucky for an alleged robbery. Then there's Clinton Briggs, murdered in Arkansas simply for not moving out of a white woman's way quickly enough.
It's just sickening. These men served their country, and this is how they were repaid.
It's hard to believe.
Were there any particularly disturbing cases that stand out?
One that is particularly symbolic is the case of Wilbur Little, lynched in Georgia for the crime of refusing to take off his military uniform.
That sends chills down my spine. It's like they were trying to strip him of his service, his dignity, everything.
Exactly. These cases, along with countless others, expose the raw hatred and dehumanization that black veterans faced upon their return. Their service, their sacrifices, seem to count for nothing in the eyes of their attackers.
It's a complete betrayal of everything they fought for. It's like the very idea of them wearing a uniform, a symbol of American pride and patriotism, was seen as a threat to the existing social order.
And it's vital to recognize that while some white veterans also face difficulties readjusting to civilian life, like the economic hardships that led to the bonus army protests demanding early payment of war bonuses, The experiences of black veterans were demonstrably worse.
Right.
Yeah.
It really lays bare the deep-seated systemic racism that permeated American society. Were there any attempts at justice for these lynched veterans? Was anyone ever held accountable?
Tragically, the justice system often failed to protect black Americans, especially in the South. Many lynchings went uninvestigated, and perpetrators were rarely, if ever, held accountable.
So there was a complete lack of accountability. It's just unimaginable that such a blatant disregard for human life could be so widespread and accepted.
Sadly, that was the reality of the time. Jim Crow laws, which enforced racial segregation and discrimination, were in full effect, creating an environment where violence against black people was often tolerated or even condoned.
It's heartbreaking, but was there any pushback against this tide of violence and injustice?
Absolutely. While the Red Summer and the mistreatment of black veterans were horrific, they also ignited a firestorm of activism and resistance. This period saw the rise of the new Negro movement, a powerful push for civil rights and equality that would have a lasting impact on American history.
Can you tell me more about this new Negro movement? What were its goals and how did it take shape?
Well, it was really a multifaceted movement that encompassed a wide range of strategies and expressions, but at its core, it was about black Americans asserting their humanity, their rights, and their refusal to be treated as second-class citizens.
So it was a direct response to the violence and oppression they were experiencing.
Exactly. And it found expression in various forms, from political activism and legal challenges to a flourishing of art, literature, and music known as the Harlem Renaissance.
So they were fighting back on multiple fronts, not just through protests, but also through creative expression.
Precisely. Figures like W.E.B. Du Bois became prominent voices of this movement, urging continued resistance and demanding full equality. One of his most powerful quotes from this era is, "We return from fighting, we return fighting."
That's incredibly powerful. It speaks to their unwavering determination, their refusal to be silenced or defeated. But what about the long-term impact of this movement? Did it achieve its goals?
Well, the fight for racial equality is a long and ongoing struggle. But the new Negro movement was a pivotal moment in American history. It laid the groundwork for the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s and continues to inspire activists and advocates today.
So even in the face of unimaginable horror, these veterans and the activists they inspired helped spark a movement that would change the course of American history.
Yes, and it's important to remember that this fight for equality is still ongoing. The legacy of the Red Summer and the courage of these black veterans should serve as a reminder that the pursuit of justice requires constant vigilance and a willingness to challenge systems of oppression wherever they exist.
It's a powerful legacy. It makes you think about how individual stories can illuminate these larger historical trends and inspire us to continue fighting for a more just and equitable world. But how did this movement actually gain traction? What were some of the key strategies and turning points that helped it gain momentum?
Well, one of the key strategies was raising awareness. Black newspapers and magazines played a crucial role in documenting the atrocities of the Red Summer and the ongoing discrimination faced by black veterans.
So they were using the power of the press to expose these injustices and rally support for their cause.
Exactly. They understood that shining a light on these horrors was essential to mobilizing public opinion and demanding change. And it wasn't just about reporting the news, it was about reframing the narrative. Black writers and artists began to challenge the prevailing stereotypes and portray black life and culture in all its richness and complexity.
This reminds me of the Harlem Renaissance, which you mentioned earlier. Was that a direct outgrowth of the new Negro movement?
Absolutely. The Harlem Renaissance was a cultural explosion that celebrated black identity and creativity. Through music, literature, art, and theater, black artists challenged racist ideologies and asserted their humanity and their right to equality. Think of figures like Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, Duke Ellington. They were all part of this movement that was reshaping how America saw black people.
It sounds like they were reclaiming their narrative and their power through art and expression.
Precisely. And it wasn't just confined to Harlem either. This cultural awakening was happening in black communities across the country. It was a powerful statement of self-determination and a challenge to the status quo.
So we see this multifaceted approach emerging: legal challenges, political activism, and this incredible outpouring of creative energy. Did they face any pushback or resistance to these efforts?
Of course, change rarely comes easily, especially when it threatens existing power structures. White supremacist groups actively resisted these efforts, often resorting to violence and intimidation.
It's a stark reminder that even in the face of progress, there are forces that seek to maintain the old order.
And it's crucial to understand that the Red Summer wasn't just about racial hatred. It was also fueled by economic anxieties,
Yeah.
competition for jobs and housing, and the deliberate spread of fear and propaganda by those in power.
You're right. The Great Migration, while offering opportunities for Black Americans, also led to increased competition for resources in northern cities, which some white residents perceived as a threat.
Exactly. And these fears were often exploited by those in power to justify discriminatory policies and practices.
It's a classic case of scapegoating, using a vulnerable group to deflect attention from larger systemic issues. And it's sadly a tactic that is still employed today.
You're absolutely right. We see it in the rhetoric surrounding immigration, in the demonization of certain religious groups, and in the perpetuation of stereotypes that dehumanize and marginalize entire communities. It's a reminder that the fight against racism and prejudice is multifaceted. It requires addressing not just individual biases,
Hmm.
but also the institutional structures that perpetuate inequality.
So how do we connect this historical knowledge to the present moment? What lessons can we learn from the experiences of Black veterans after World War I?
Well, one key takeaway is that the struggle for equality is a continuum. The events of the Red Summer weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a larger pattern of racial violence and oppression that continues to this day.
It's a history that we can't afford to ignore or downplay.
Exactly. And it's crucial to recognize that the fight for racial justice isn't just about achieving legal equality. It's about dismantling the systemic structures that perpetuate disparities in wealth, education, healthcare, and opportunity.
It's about creating a society where everyone has a fair chance to succeed regardless of the color of their skin.
Absolutely. We've come a long way since the Red Summer, but we still have a long way to go. The fight for racial justice is far from over.
That's a sobering thought, but also a call to action.
Precisely. And I think the stories of these African American veterans can serve as both a source of inspiration and a reminder of the work that still needs to be done. Their unwavering determination to fight for their rights, even after facing unimaginable horrors, is a testament to the power of hope and the enduring belief in a better future.
What's particularly striking to me is the courage and resilience they displayed in the face of such adversity. It makes you question how they found the strength to keep fighting when all the odds seem stacked against them.
It's really remarkable. And it speaks to the power of community, of shared purpose, and of the unwavering belief in the possibility of a more just and equitable world. Their stories remind us that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit can endure, and that the fight for justice, so arduous, is always worth fighting.
I couldn't agree more. Their sacrifices and their legacy should serve as a guiding light for us all as we continue the fight for a more just and equitable society. But what are some tangible steps that we can take to continue this fight? How do we move beyond simply acknowledging these injustices and actually work towards dismantling the systems that perpetuate them?
And that's a great question, and it's one that requires a multi-pronged approach. First and foremost, we need to educate ourselves about the history of racial injustice in this country. We need to understand the roots of these problems and how they continue to manifest in our society today.
So knowledge is power, essentially. Understanding the problem is the first step to solving it.
Exactly. And it's not just about learning the facts, it's about actively engaging with these histories, listening to the voices of those who have been marginalized, and being willing to challenge our own biases and assumptions.
So it's about self-reflection and challenging our own preconceived notions.
Absolutely. And it's about having uncomfortable conversations with our families and friends, calling out racism and prejudice when we see it, and using our voices and our platforms to amplify the voices of those who are fighting for justice.
That takes courage to speak up even when it's uncomfortable.
It does, but it's essential. Silence is complicity. We all have a responsibility to speak up against injustice and to work towards creating a more just and equitable world. And that work can take many forms.
So what are some concrete ways we can contribute to this fight?
Well, we can support organizations that are working to combat racial injustice. We can advocate for policy changes that address systemic inequalities. And we can educate ourselves and others about the history of racism and its ongoing impact. We can also choose to spend our money consciously supporting businesses owned by people of color and investing in communities that have been historically marginalized.
It sounds like there are many different ways to make a difference, both on an individual and collective level.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that change happens incrementally. Every action we take, no matter how small it may seem, contributes to the larger movement for justice.
It's about chipping away at the systems of oppression one step at a time. But what about the emotional toll of this work? Engaging with these difficult histories and confronting these injustices can be emotionally draining.
You're absolutely right. It's important to prioritize self-care and to find healthy ways to cope with the emotional weight of this work.
So it's okay to take breaks, to step back when we need to, and to replenish our own emotional reserves so that we can continue the fight.
Absolutely. We can't pour from an empty cup. We need to take care of ourselves, both physically and emotionally, if we want to be effective advocates for change.
And it's important to find support in our communities and to connect with others who are also engaged in this work.
Yes, solidarity and community are essential. We're stronger together. And we need to remember that even in the face of immense challenges, there is always hope. The fight for racial justice is a marathon, not a sprint, and it requires endurance, perseverance, and an unwavering belief in the possibility of a better future.
It's inspiring to think that even amidst the horrors of the Red Summer, these Black veterans and the activists they inspired found the strength to continue fighting for a more just and equitable world. Their legacy serves as a reminder that change is possible and that each of us has a role to play in making that change happen.
Their stories are a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit and a call to action for us all.
Speaking of action, I'm curious to know more about the specific legal challenges that were mounted during this period. What were some of the key cases and organizations that emerged to fight for the rights of Black Americans, particularly Black veterans?
Well, one of the most important organizations that emerged during this period was the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP.
The NAACP, that's a name that resonates even today. What was their role in the fight for racial justice during this era?
The NAACP was founded in 1909, just a few years before World War I, and it quickly became a leading force in the fight for civil rights. They employed a multi-pronged approach using legal challenges, lobbying efforts, and public education campaigns to combat racial discrimination and violence.
So they were fighting on multiple fronts, similar to the broader New Negro movement.
Exactly. They understood that systemic change required a multifaceted approach.
What were some of their key legal victories during this period?
One of their most significant early victories was the 1915 Supreme Court case, Gwynne v. United States, which struck down the grandfather clause used in Oklahoma and other southern states to disenfranchise Black voters.
So they were challenging the very laws that were designed to suppress Black political power.
Exactly. They recognized that voting rights were essential to achieving full citizenship and equality.
What other legal battles did they wage during this era?
They also challenged residential segregation laws, discriminatory hiring practices, and the pervasive violence that Black Americans faced, including the epidemic of lynchings.
Did they face much opposition to their work?
Oh, absolutely. They were constantly battering resistance from white supremacist groups and individuals who sought to maintain the existing racial hierarchy.
It must have been incredibly challenging to fight for justice in such a hostile environment.
It was, but they persevered, and their work laid the foundation for the civil rights movement that would gain momentum in the decades to come.
It's inspiring to think about their unwavering commitment to justice, even in the face of such daunting obstacles. But what about the impact of World War I on their work? Did the war effort and the experiences of Black veterans influence their strategies or priorities?
That's a great question. And the answer is a resounding yes. The war had a profound impact on the NAACP's work.
How so?
Well, for one thing, the war exposed the hypocrisy of America's claim to be a beacon of democracy and freedom, while simultaneously denying basic rights to its Black citizens.
You mean the whole fighting for democracy abroad while facing racism at home dynamic we discussed earlier?
Exactly. That contradiction became glaringly apparent during the war, and the NAACP seized upon it to amplify their calls for racial justice.
So they used the war as a platform to highlight the inconsistencies in America's democratic ideals.
Precisely. They argued that if Black Americans were deemed worthy of fighting and dying for their country, they were also worthy of full citizenship and equal rights.
That's a powerful argument, and it's one that resonated with many Americans, both Black and white.
It did, and it helped to galvanize support for the NAACP's mission.
But it wasn't just about rhetoric, was it? Did the war also have a tangible impact on their legal strategies or priorities?
It did. For example, the NAACP began to focus more specifically on the issue of lynching, which had reached epidemic proportions during and after the war.
You mentioned that they were already working on this issue, but did the war escalate their efforts?
It did. The war, in a sense, provided them with more ammunition. They could now point to the sacrifices of Black veterans as evidence of their patriotism and their right to protection under the law.
So they were using the service of Black veterans to challenge the very notion that Black people were somehow less deserving of protection or justice.
Exactly. They argued that if black men were considered good enough to fight and die for their country, they were certainly good enough to be protected from mob violence.
That makes perfect sense. But did they face any pushback or resistance to these arguments?
Of course, the forces of white supremacy were deeply entrenched, and they weren't going to give up their power easily.
So the fight continued even after the war ended.
It did, and it would continue for decades to come. But the war in many ways marked a turning point. It exposed the hypocrisy of America's racial hierarchy and gave new urgency to the fight for equal rights.
It's a reminder that progress is rarely linear, and that even the most horrific events can sometimes serve as catalysts for change.
Absolutely. And it's a testament to the resilience and determination of those who fought for justice both during and after the war. Their courage and their unwavering belief in a better future continue to inspire us today.
That's a powerful message. But as we delve deeper into this history, it makes me wonder, did the government ever acknowledge the injustices faced by Black veterans? Was there any attempt at reconciliation or reparations for the horrors they endured?
That's a really important question, and unfortunately the answer is complicated. While there were some efforts to acknowledge the injustices, true reconciliation and reparations have been elusive.
So it's a story of partial recognition, but a lack of meaningful action.
Sadly, yes. There were isolated instances of support. For instance, some white veterans groups did speak out against the mistreatment of their black counterparts, and certain newspapers and magazines, primarily those geared towards black audiences, did advocate for justice.
That's encouraging, at least a small glimmer of solidarity. But what about on a governmental level? Was there any official recognition of these injustices?
There were some limited efforts. In 1919, President Woodrow Wilson did publicly condemn mob violence, but he stopped short of addressing the specific targeting of black veterans. And while some investigations were launched into the Red Summer riots, very few perpetrators were ever brought to justice.
So a lot of talk, but very little action. It seems like a pattern we've seen throughout history. But were there any attempts to provide material support or compensation for these veterans?
There were a few piecemeal efforts. For instance, the War Risk Insurance Act of 1917 did provide some benefits to disabled veterans, but its implementation was often riddled with discrimination. Black veterans frequently faced obstacles in accessing these benefits, and the amounts they received were often far less than what their white counterparts received.
It's like they were being re-traumatized by the very system that was supposed to be supporting them. It sounds like a classic example of institutional racism.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it highlights the limitations of simply enacting laws without addressing the underlying prejudices and discriminatory practices within those systems.
So where does that leave us today? What can be done to finally address these historical injustices and provide some measure of closure for these veterans and their descendants?
Well, there's a growing movement advocating for reparations for the descendants of slaves, and that conversation naturally extends to the specific injustices faced by black veterans. Reparations can take various forms, from financial compensation to investments in education, healthcare, and economic development in black communities.
It sounds like a complex issue with no easy answers. But acknowledging these injustices and having these difficult conversations is a crucial first step.
Absolutely. We can't simply sweep these uncomfortable truths under the rug. We need to confront them head on if we want to move towards a more just and equitable society. And that starts with educating ourselves and others about this history, amplifying the voices of those who've been marginalized, and advocating for policies that address these systemic issues.
It's a call to action for all of us. We can't simply be passive observers of history. We have a responsibility to learn from the past and to work towards a better future.
Well said. And I think it's important to remember that this fight for racial justice is not just about righting past wrongs. It's about creating a present and a future where everyone has the opportunity to thrive regardless of their race or background.
So to our listener, we leave you with this. What will you do with this knowledge? How can you contribute to the ongoing struggle for equality and justice? What stories of resilience and resistance can you uncover and share with the world? The fight for a more just and equitable world continues, and each of us has a role to play. Keep questioning, keep learning, and keep pushing for change.